So as Julian said, we talked as a group on this topic before, but we think it's a really important one. So I'm going to use some of the things from the North Sea Transition Authority as a bit of a case study to how we as an organisation have influenced our board, our leadership team and our stakeholders on the topic of data. There'll be plenty of time towards the end to ask some questions, but do feel free to put them in the chat as we go and we'll circle back round to them at the end. So as a starting point, I was just going to talk a bit about who we are as an organisation. Just appreciate some of you may not have come across us before. So we're North Sea Transition Authority, the NSTA. Our role is to regulate and influence aspects of offshore energy in the UK. So oil, gas, offshore hydrogen and carbon storage being the primary ones there. At the moment, we've got three key priorities as an organisation. Firstly, ensuring UK energy security of supply. Secondly, decarbonising that supply as much as possible through emissions reduction, and then accelerating the energy transition. So overall, our purpose as an organisation is to aim to act as an integrating force in the UK energy basin and essentially get the full economic potential and ensure the UK has its energy supply. This is what we call our big opportunity slide. So this gives you a bit of an idea of what the opportunities are in the UK and in the North Sea in terms of energy. So when we look out to 2030, we reckon there's about £200 billion worth of investment and spend in the energy area across all different types of offshore energy. That's essentially underpins the entire industry, is a world-class, highly skilled workforce of 200,000 people in the supply chain. And those roles will exist as we move through the different types of energy that the UK is using. We know that there's huge potential from offshore wind, for example. We also know that the carbon storage industry gives us the opportunity as the UK to capture the UK's carbon and essentially capture 60% of the UK's abatement in terms of emissions from the UK. So a really important purpose as an organisation. And I wanted to just give you that overview before jumping into our digital and data approach, because it's key to how we have influenced our stakeholders in the data arena. So a bit more about us in terms of our digital and data strategy. So we're nearing the end of our 5-year digital and data strategy. And as you can see from the left-hand side of this slide, our strategy is based around 5 pillars. Now, we intentionally started our strategy with people, skills and culture on the basis that if we don't have the right people, the right culture in the organisation, then none of the rest of it, whether that's the data or the technology we use to access it, will ever be important if we don't have the ability to use that data and use those tools. Across our website, we provide a huge amount of data and insights, and that's key to our transforming the access to information. We also hold huge values of industry data. We've got over 1 petabyte of industry data that can be accessed through our platforms, and the majority of that can be accessed publicly. So if you wanted to, you could log on to our platforms and actually see the data that we are holding. We also hold a huge amount of geospatial data. So we're getting about 2 million hits on our APIs from our spatial server a week, and over 500 million since that service has been up and running. And these are all key elements in terms of how we're then moving on in our digital strategy to ensure that data is available for analytics and intelligence, that as a small government public sector organisation, we partner and we collaborate with other organisations to make sure that we can deliver the services that people need. But the final pillar in the digital strategy is around influence and promotion. So it's key to us as an organisation that the industry are doing what they can with data, and they are using digital tools in that work as well. So influence for us has always been a key part of our strategy, and links back round then to the topic for today of why and how you can influence boards and stakeholders on data. So these are the 6 areas that I'm going to talk through briefly today. Now, firstly, for me, ensuring that your leadership teams or your boards understand what data is and understand the importance of it is a very key starting point. But for me, I quite quickly move on from talking about the data itself into what the outcomes can be from the use of that data. So how we can use data for making better decisions, how we can provide people with data that enables the change of way they do things, the changes of behaviors. Also then looking at ways that data can be used for new priorities rather than the purpose it was generated for originally, and how if we collaborate using new technologies, we can get different value than we originally envisaged out of that data asset. And then circling back round to the influence aspect, influencing others to do the same in terms of using their data and working better together as we go forward. So starting off with talking about data with leadership teams. Now, I'm sure nobody on this call thinks that data is dull, but if you put data on a board agenda or a leadership team agenda, you're probably going to get a groan from at least one person in the room. So for me, it's important that leadership teams understand data, but they don't necessarily need to understand the actual data itself. They need to understand what the data can do for them. So this is an actual slide that we used with our leadership team. The graph in itself isn't really so relevant, but what we were trying to get across to our leadership team was that data quality is a key aspect to how we do our work. Now, quite often you will talk to people and you say you work in digital or data, and they say, oh, great, what do you know about AI? So jumping straight to AI is definitely something I'm hearing more and more with leadership teams that I talk to. And actually, the important thing with AI that I'm sure we all know is you can't work with good AI without good data. The data topic itself, though, is perhaps less interesting to people. So we've talked to our leadership team and said, you need to bear with us in terms of doing the fun stuff. Our data isn't perfect. We need to make sure the quality of our data is really high. We need to talk about data in the organization in a way that means something to people rather than switching people off because they think it's to do with maths or documents or things that they're perhaps not so interested in. And we're encouraging our leadership team to talk to our data team. So when we've talked about this slide here, where essentially what we're saying is we can't do some of the fun things that we need to yet with data because some of the attributes are missing in our data. It gives them a visual representation to understand what some of the issues are and how we're looking at addressing those issues over time. After talking initially at that high level with leadership teams around data, I think it's really important to move into that second area quickly, using the data for making better decisions. Everybody makes decisions in their daily working lives, and we certainly make decisions internally, and we enable the industry to make decisions as well. Using data to make better decisions, I think nobody is going to argue with. But in terms of talking to leadership teams, we focus very much on saying, what do you actually need to make those decisions? So our starting point was issuing a number of reports in terms of data insights of what do we as an organization need the industry to know. Making that available in a report format rather than talking about the data has been a key aspect for us in terms of getting people on board. Taking that a step further, then we started to work on some dynamic dashboards and making those available externally, enabling people to customize those reports and actually get the meaningful insight that they needed for the job that they were doing was definitely key. Internally, then we started to hear people say, well, actually, we've seen these external dashboards that you've made available. The industry is saying great things about them, but they don't quite give us enough internally to make the regulatory decisions that we need to do our day jobs. So we've actually then focused on providing far more detail internally and focused on those internal dashboards to give people easy access to data. Our team doesn't need to know where the data is stored. They don't need to know what the quality of the data is and how we manage that. But by actually showing something that they can interact with these dynamic dashboards, it's got people understanding the importance of data and what it can actually mean to them in their day jobs. The third area that I was going to talk about was providing data to change behaviors. So I mentioned earlier that our second priority is to reduce emissions in the UK North Sea. It's clearly a key priority for net zero as a country and how we operate as an offshore energy industry. We can only do that if we understand the emissions that are currently there and understand what we need to do to enable the changes that will reduce those emissions over time. So we started on a project to collect emissions data. We worked quite hard on making sure that data was quality controlled and it was consistent and it was in the same metric volumes and things like that. And that has enabled us then to generate these dashboards and reports, which we provide externally. What we've seen is a reduction in recent years of emissions across the UK sector. We need those emissions to halve by 2030, and that's our minimum expectation on industry. Our chief exec talks about this frequently with industry. He doesn't talk about data directly, but he is using the data in those conversations. So working with those people who are in positions of influence, it's really getting them to understand what they need to know and then providing them with the data and information that gives them that information at their fingertips without talking about the data itself. The next area is talking about enabling data to be used for new priorities. Now, I've put this in because actually for us, this has seen the greatest addition in terms of investment to our data portfolio by actually using it for different reasons. In the conversations that we have with our leadership team and our board, they understand the importance of the carbon storage round that we've just done as an organization. I didn't need to talk to them specifically about the need for data, but actually showing them the data and showing how that data can be used to make decisions has convinced them that we definitely need to spend more on our GIS platforms. We need to continue to invest and deliver on our digital and data strategy. So here you can see a screenshot from our GIS systems. So spatial information that is being used to understand the potential for carbon storage in the North Sea. We know that data was key to people making those applications because we saw a 20-fold increase on data downloads on the day of the license round launch. On the right-hand side, you can see a screenshot of seismic data. So this is some of the more detailed technical data that we're holding in our platforms that people can access and actually use for making those types of decisions. This, for me, is a really important way to influence boards on data and the need for data quality. So we talk quite a lot at this level with our board and our leadership team, as opposed to talking about the specific data. And taking that a step further, we're seeing data that was collected for one purpose, originally from oil and gas legacy operations over 60 years, and some that the UK government funded directly about 10 years ago. We're seeing that data being taken and people looking at it in a different way. So some of that data is no longer needed in the industry that it was created for. The top shallow seismic subsurface data can be used for different things now. It can be used to get an understanding of the best place to site offshore wind farms. So we're seeing people taking our data, reprocessing it, and then repurposing that in GIS maps to be able to understand the basin better, and then leading to successful operations and applications in a recent ScotWind licensing round. For me, again, talking to boards about the importance of data, this is the kind of thing that people understand. Then you can have the conversations about the need for data quality, the need for completeness, the need for making data machine readable and easily accessible really comes to life for people when you can link it to one of the organization's priorities. So for us, accelerating the energy transition. I said earlier, we're a relatively small organisation in the public sector sense, and some of the things that we do, we need to work with others to get the greatest value. So collaborating using different and new technologies is always going to be important to us. So a member of our GIS team worked with a couple of other government organisations, the Crown Estate and the Crown Estate Scotland, to basically pull all of the data in using APIs onto a GIS map, which showed all of the activities that were happening in offshore energy in the North Sea basin. Now, we didn't ask that individual to build and create this app, but she saw a need for it and started to work with colleagues on it. This app, and probably this screenshot, is used most frequently by our chief exec and our chair in external conversations in terms of how value can be added in the energy basin. So for me, that value is partially being added through the data and through the digital tools that enable the access of that data. I don't need to convince our chief exec to talk about data. He can talk about the value that is being created in the energy basin, and the data is the catalyst that is enabling those conversations. Following on from the creation of this app, we realized that actually there's huge pockets of excellence in data management across the offshore energy sector. But one thing that perhaps we weren't collectively doing so well was to work together and see that data all in one place. So a couple of years ago, we created a task force, the Offshore Energy Data Strategy Task Force, that basically brought together a number of the organizations that were working in data management or were influencing in data management in the sector. And we said, how can we actually create a strategy that means that we've got a cohesive approach across those different parts of the subsector? So this strategy is now in place. It's got 3 primary recommendations. The first one being that we should unify our data principles. We need to make sure that the data that we're collecting and holding is consistent, of a consistent standard and quality across the sector to be able to use it better. The second area, we looked at delivering a common data toolkit. So how can we get our data from A to B? How can we make sure that data isn't duplicated, that it's interoperable across our different platforms? And actually that everybody working in the sector knows that the portals and platforms are there to access data and how they can go about doing it. The third area is driving cross-sector digitalization. So this is saying, do we have the right conditions in place for the sector to make the best use out of data and the digital tools they have? So this work stream's looking at things like creating and ensuring we have the right data and digital skills across the sector, ensuring the sector are complying with cybersecurity best practice. What this has enabled us to do as a data and digital team is say we've managed to influence our own internal stakeholders on the importance of data. Let's take that a step further. So how can we influence others to do the same? We know it's such an important topic, but we're not always convinced that people are getting the greatest value out of data. By approaching it from this point of view, we're taking it a step further and saying, what are the outcomes that we can deliver? We know from our work that we've been able to create industries around carbon storage and hydrogen in the future that we wouldn't have been able to create if we didn't have those data sources in place. And then finally, the final point for me is don't try and do this on your own. So influencing stakeholders on data and on digital tools that use them, you can't do that in isolation. So I said earlier, we're a relatively small public sector organisation. We're about 250 people in total. We need to work and work with the expertise and advice of different organisations. So this is just a short selection of the organisations that we're actively working on in the data and digital area. So it's not the full organisation, but in terms of our data efforts, these are the organisations that we work with on quite a regular basis to ensure that we're influencing others on data and digital, but also sharing learnings across these different organisations. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea and a bit of a case study of how you can talk to your stakeholders, whether that's your board, your leadership team, on digital and data in a way that enables them to see the importance without perhaps switching off at the beginning of the conversation, as some have been. Please feel free to reach out to me. I sit on the data management committee with Julian and Ed, and we're always keen to hear topics that other people are interested in terms of talks, but also I'm also keen to link up with people in terms of learnings across different organisations and sectors. So please do feel free to reach out. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we are open to questions and answers.
Lovely. Thank you, Nick. That's really useful, a really interesting start point there. As mentioned, if you could put your questions in the chat, I will then ask them on your behalf to Nick, and that makes the recording work a little bit better that way around. Probably from me, though, to start point is just interested in you. It sounds like you have a fairly data literate leadership within your organization. Is that by design or by accident? Has the maturity of thinking changed over time? Are they getting better? What are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think we're lucky in a way in that the industry that we're regulating is a STEM-based industry. So there are a lot of people working in the industry, whether it's in sort of data and digital, whether it's in engineering or other sort of operational roles where there's a need for data and information. So as a starting point, our first chief executive had a research background. So he wanted data. He wanted data on day one. He wanted to make sure as a newly formed organization, we were making the right decisions. So I think that really does help. But I think then the other thing is having data and digital as a conversation around the board or the leadership table when it's not about data. So I always smile when one of my colleagues mentions, oh, we've got the data for this, we did this using these maps, because it shows to me that we're not just having the conversations about data, we're having the conversations about how can we deliver energy security, how can we deliver emissions reduction. Both of those always come down to what does the data say, how can we interpret the data. So I think for me, it's making sure you're having those conversations in the right way. So I think we're lucky, yes, we've got a data literate team, but I think it's also the approach you take in terms of when you talk about it as well.
And what are your thoughts about trying to balance the influence or balance the thinking around use of clever tools and investing in the data? Because for many organizations, investing in tools is viewed as a quick fix. We've got this clever bit of AI, whatever, can make wondrous new insights into our data. But as we all know, if the data underneath it all is not fit for purpose, you're perhaps not getting there. So what's the maturity of thinking, and how do you actually help sway the arguments so people realize they've got to focus on the data as much as the tools?
So I don't think with this audience we're going to have to sell the fact that the data has to come first, right? You have to have good, high quality data, and you have to have as complete a set of data as you can, depending on the area that you're talking about. That said, there's no point collecting and having data just sitting on your platforms, not doing anything. Whilst there is a sort of for us, a national archiving aspect of it, if you aren't using the data, you're not getting the value from it. So the digital tools in terms of putting investment in, I think really helps to sell the need for the data, but I don't think you can do one or the other. So I would say put the investment into the data, but use some digital tools to pilot some things, to show some use cases until you can get, for us, until we've managed to get the data on the maps looking very pretty, people didn't want to talk about the data. So I think the two go hand in hand, but without one, you can't do the other.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So the question come through from Edith. So she's interested in understanding what's the greatest challenge in getting data-driven, sort of influencing business decision making. So what's your greatest challenge in getting the, if you like, the behaviours right?
I think one of the challenges is that when you're in a leadership role, people quite often have got into their leadership role through their experience and their knowledge, and quite often they will want to go with their gut feeling and reaction. So I think that's one of the greatest challenges, is convincing people. It's not that their gut reaction decision is wrong. It's just that actually, if you use the data, you might be able to, one, reach that decision quicker, or you might be able to verify that that gut reaction is right. So I think that's the challenge, is not approaching it from the point of view if you can't make a decision without data. It's convincing people and bringing you along that actually you're going to make their life easier and you're going to make their decision better if they use the data. And that can be a challenge, because people don't want to be told that they have got the wrong answer or they're going to make the wrong decision if they don't have the data in front of them.
Yeah, that comment there about people going on gut feel, that's something behavior I've talked about for over many years, and I won't digress too much onto that. But yeah, it is a challenge. It's kind of trying to not devalue the person's opinion, but saying, well, let's either confirm that with the data to actually take your hunch and build it in, and reassure people that actually it was right, or disprove it, as the other case may be. So Ed's asked the question really in terms of, again, thinking on the people, the culture, and on the side of data, of just thinking about how you might engage the impact of the approach. Sort of how do you actually keep the momentum up on sort of the people and culture side? And possibly related to that is your thoughts, maybe if you're maybe new to an organization, of what are the traits you might want to look out for that gives you a clue that you've got a fairly good data literacy in the organization or not?
Yeah, so I think it's really difficult to gauge the impact of anything on people and culture, because it's not as clear cut. You can't put a nice metric on, is the culture the right thing? For me, I think the way we've gauged it is to see the kind of conversations and the things we're being asked to do. So as an example, our board asked me to act as the agile champion across the organization and roll out agile tools to colleagues outside the digital and data team, having seen how our way of using agile as a project methodology had enabled us to deliver things quicker. So whilst I'm not saying we've trained everybody in agile project methodology, what that has done from my point of view is to say there is an impact on that culture bit, because we're being asked to push this out and these tools out in other areas of the organization. That's then enabled us as an organization to do things in a different way on the agile front. So I think anecdotal aspects in terms of gauging the impact. I think the question around how do you judge whether you've got good data literacy in an organization is the questions you get asked. So when we have new starters come in and they say, can I use Python on my laptop? Can I use Power BI or Tableau or lots of different tools? That gives you a good indication in terms of people are not going to be asking for those sort of tools if they're not data literate. So I think talking about what you can achieve through the use of data and better decisions really helps you to get an idea and to continue that cultural change. So never stop talking about data and digital, but always focus what can data and digital do to make individuals' lives better in the workplace, rather than focusing on conversations around data quality.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things I somewhat cruelly sometimes malign our stats colleagues, because if they get handed a very big data set, they sometimes forget to think about how good is the data, and they will dive straight into the tools. So being technology literate is not necessarily the same as data literate, but actually there is an overlap there. So some good points there. Anyway, the question from Emil, an interesting one to think through, is sort of, have you ever had to deal with situations where there's somebody, one of your key stakeholders perhaps, who is overly protective of their data and perhaps hanging on to it and not letting you get access to it, or trying to control it?
Sure. So we work with industry a lot and we collect a lot of industry data. So most organizations are rightly protective of their data, but also of what they can do with that data. So we've worked really closely with our industry colleagues to understand why people feel protective about their data. And usually it's really good measures of nobody else will understand it, or we're worried that somebody would do something wrong with it in terms of data privacy, or we think we're going to get commercial advantage out of it by holding on to it without someone having it. So I think how we kind of handle that situation is to show them what is possible with that shared data. So we've done a couple of things. We annually hold a meeting with our chief exec, with the managing directors of all of the companies operating, or the larger companies operating in this sector, and we bring them into a room face to face and we show them benchmarks that we have created from their data. So we will benchmark them across a whole load of measures, so from operational performance to how quickly they pay their bills, to the quality of their data. We in the room then say to the best performers, can you talk to the industry about how you have created this best performance? And we almost create a sense of competitiveness in the room, to say, some of your peers are doing really well. Why are you perhaps not performing so strongly in this area? So focusing on the positives, that enables us to change behavior, but it also enables us to do exactly what you're asking, Emil, in terms of how can we open up people to share their data? We can show them the value in sharing the data. So if we didn't have that data shared, we couldn't create the benchmarks. We couldn't have those good conversations, those learnings, which then circle around and enable them to change performance and behaviors. So again, for me, it's not about talking about the data. It's about using the data in a conversation that links to outcomes and that people can actually see how that can benefit them in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting your comment there about appealing to people's competitive nature. I think don't underestimate, certainly from my experience, don't underestimate the power of competition. If people can see not just that they are slightly behind the leaders, but actually they're miles behind the leaders, then they actually get a very visual clue that they need to improve.
Yeah.
And certainly I've used that very effectively in the past.
And yeah, and I think that visualizing of data is important, right? So if you talk to someone on the board and you say, we're going to use BI tools and we're going to do this and that, and they're going to switch off. If you can show them straight away an interactive dashboard that gives them the data that they need very quickly, or you can show them a map that they can go, oh yeah, now I understand. You can put a carbon storage and an offshore wind in the same area. You've just got to do it in the right way. That really helps people to understand why not to be protective about their data. I should say, though, we don't deal with a huge amount of personal data. So there are sort of data privacy and protection issues that perhaps we don't have to deal with quite so much in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, it's interesting there. So a question from Mark, who patiently put it in a little while ago, and I'm getting around to it now, but it's an interesting one which might generate some discussion really, is sort of now we live in a post-truth world thanks to generative AI. In other words, the technology is making it all up. How do you provide assurance that the data you've collected actually represents a real world situation? How do you actually try and make sure that the outputs of the AI are suitably sort of, there's a suitable health warning around them about whether they can be trusted or not?
Mm-hmm. So I think you've got to use them for the right purpose as a starting point. So we've just rolled out Copilot internally. And the message that we're giving to our team is it's Copilot, not autopilot. So it can generate something that you can start to use. It's a tool in the same way as if you Googled something, it would give you some information. You would then use that tool to your next step. So I think it's looking at the use of Gen AI in the right areas. It's looking at using it as a tool, not as the answer to everything. And making sure you're not relying on it, but you're using it to help you add value.
Yeah, and I think it also hopefully it gets away from the issue. And the word I'm hearing a lot around AI is hallucination, where the tool is convinced it's come up with an answer that's plausible but wrong. So question from Andrew, and I think it might lead into other things. Is sort of the question he posed was, what was the last internal blog or article you released to influence the influencers? And I think actually that gets into a wider thing of how do you actually keep up a stream of communication to actually guide people and educate them?
So a few things, I guess, Andrew. Our most recent intranet blog article was around innovation. So not strictly on data, but on innovation. So my team piloted the idea of innovation time last year. So every other Wednesday afternoon, we would not do core business. We would put it aside for innovation. Now, Google have done this for years, 3M, there are all sorts of different examples of use of innovation time, but we wanted something that worked for us. We piloted that as a team, and we then rolled that out across the whole organization. So now once a month, the team takes a Wednesday afternoon out for innovation. We're quite flexible in what people can use for that. So some people use it to read some journal articles. Some people have learnt Python during innovation time. So not strictly data, but influencing the people that influence firstly showing that it worked. We piloted it in one team and then pushed it out across the whole organization. So that's one thing. The other thing that we had an all staff last week. We all went off site and our chief exec used huge amounts of data in his opening presentation. Now, we didn't talk about data at all, but the use of data for our colleagues to see in terms of linking to those three priorities, that's really key. So getting your influencers to talk about data without realizing they're talking about data is one thing. The next stage of that is then when they start talking about the data. So our chairman closed the conference and he said, you know, he would like to say some fantastic words about the data team. So for me, that's the next phase of once you've convinced people, then you can start them talking about the data itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of gets into a point that when I did a similar kind of session this time last year, I suggested that never use the word data. So if we're talking to a non-data literate audience, we need to talk about business outcomes, we need to talk about efficiency, profitability, etc., and not talk about data. I mean, it sounds like you're in a slightly more enlightened organization, but any thoughts you've got about whether we should or shouldn't use the word data, and depending on the audience?
I think it depends on the context, right? And it depends on the maturity of the organization. So we had a similar one around processes. So people, when you started talking about processes, everybody switches off. So we started talking about workflows and how you can make your day-to-day work more interesting. And actually more people got engaged with that and just by the change of word. So we've now gone back to talking about processes now that we've convinced people and brought people on board. So I don't think I wouldn't ban the use of the word data across everything, but I think you've got to pick the right time. You've got to pick your audience and who you're talking to.
Yeah, I agreed. I think like all these things, you've got to choose you've got to think about your audience, and I think collectively for many of our audiences, if we start talking about, the data profiling said that it was 58% such and such, we're losing some people. They don't think that way. So part of the message we've got is how do we actually communicate the language they're familiar with.
Yeah.
So question from Ed was really about sort of how do you keep the data quality high so that your performance dashboards are actually telling you the truth, you're not misleading you, and how do you actually help businesses decide on priorities for any areas around quality improvement work?
So a couple of things worth mentioning. So when we take data in from industry, we've put in machine validation on the incoming data. So that enables us with data we're collecting from industry going forward, we are managing the quality on the way in. We also have done some machine assisted reading of documents to ensure that the existing collection of data is the right quality. So the one I always like to use is a piece of data that is a white document with 4 black holes down one side, has clearly been taken out of a ring binder at some point. Someone's run it through a photocopier to create it and make it electronic. Actually, that data isn't high enough quality for people to use for things like machine learning going forward. So we're looking at how we can use OCR and other technologies to improve the quality of existing data that is held. But we then also have the human aspect of this. So we have something called the Analyst Integration Group, which is an internal group. If you are putting any data outside of the organization, so in a dashboard or a report, it needs to go through that group. So that group acts as a bit of a quality assurance thing. It does a sense check. It asks the questions of how you've generated the analysis to ensure that what's going outside of the organization can be relied on in terms of the quality and then the analysis that's been done on it.
So is that group kind of like your organization-wide community of the sort of the enlightened data people trying to influence different teams in different ways?
Yeah, so that will have our data analysts on, it'll have our data professionals in terms of the data management side, and our data infrastructure architecture will be represented on there as well. Our economists will be represented on there. So we've got a cross section of both data users, those that are using it for analysis, but then also decisions, and also our data management and architectural professions as well. But you asked the second part of the question around how businesses decide on the priorities for data quality improvement. I think for us, we focused again on the outcomes, so not necessarily on the data types or the data attributes, but saying, what do we as an organization need to do? So, for example, we knew our colleagues were interested in a particular geographical area and wanted to put something out to industry in that area. So we focused our data quality efforts on ensuring the data in that geographic area was of the highest quality, rather than trying to do the entire basin in one go, because we knew that the most value could be added from focusing on that. And when I say we've done that, that's interacting with industry and getting industry to resubmit data and cleaning up in various things. So I think, again, it's outcome driven, Ryan, trying to approach the whole collection in one go.
Yeah, and I think that also gets into, and certainly from my perspective, I think that it's valid to make a business decision not to improve poor quality data. It may be that it's data that was a survey that was done 5 years ago. You can't go back and redo the survey, so you might have to accept that it isn't complete and it never will be. But understanding that and accepting it, and then understanding how that might influence the decision making, the analytics, that's probably the more important point of getting people to think more objectively about, if we understand the quality, how does that impact the analysis that we're using? So good. Okay, so I think we're drawing to a close there. So any parting thoughts from you, really, in terms of key takeaways, really, if anybody is trying to communicate data to their colleagues who might be a little bit less data savvy?
Think about the outcomes your colleagues are trying to achieve rather than the topic you want to talk to them about. So how can what you're doing enable them either to make their daily job easier, better, more fun, whatever it is, or how can you enable them to deliver on outcomes that they didn't know how to deliver, they could deliver quicker. Do all that through use of data, but as Julian said, don't focus on talking about data quality in isolation or the use of the word data overly too much. Talk about the outcomes and how you can help them achieve their outcomes better.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. So a really engaging presentation and a good conversation afterwards.